Hello, I'm Julie Bond. I'm one of the directors of the site at Swandro in Orkney, and that's what it looks like when the sea is coming right over the site. And what I want to talk to you about is what it's like to dig this kind of excavation, what kind of information we can get from it, and why what look like really unimportant sites can turn out to be really important. I We've been working for some years on the island of Rousay, which is just north of mainland Orkney. And there's a whole series of sites which are eroding into the sea along the coastline there. We were looking at some of them, the smaller and less important ones almost, in order to try and understand what kind of information we could get from them and what coastal erosion looked like in this environment. This is the site of Swandro. Um, it was recorded as a small Iron Age roundhouse, which was being gradually eroded by the sea right next to a really active boulder beach. And I was interested in it. We were interested in it because it had um, a Norse longhouse right next to it and a Pictish and Viking cemetery, the famous cemetery of Westness just around the corner. And that struck us as meaning that this was could be potentially a really important multi-period site. But I must admit, when we first saw it, it didn't look too promising. As you can see, if I can just get a no, I can't. But as you can see, the beach around here is sloping down onto this really active boulder beach. You can see the size of some of the boulders down there, which suggested that any erosion that had happened had ground everything away down to bedrock, and we weren't going to be able to find anything. However, as we were standing there, feeling a little disappointed, I looked down and saw a stone um, in the ground, in amongst all those boulders, which was actually standing upright. So, in good archaeological fashion, I kicked it, and it didn't move, which suggested that there was something set into the ground under all those active boulders. And that was the first clue we had that there was something else going on here. We started to move those boulders and start to excavate. And as you can see, features were appearing and archaeological material was appearing under the boulders, which we really didn't expect. And you can see some of those first stones that we saw actually starting to appear out of the beach just there. Um, what we found under that boulder beach was not at all what we were expecting. As you can see, this is a whole series of what look like concentric walls, 25, 30 meters across, surviving under the boulder beach. We were not convinced that this was, well, it certainly wasn't a small Iron Age roundhouse. If it was Iron Age, that would suggest it was a broch, but these walls aren't right for a broch. There's too many of them, and most of them, as you can see, face outwards. So we weren't really sure what we were dealing with. One of the important things with the Swandro project and all these excavations we've done on Rousay is to try and raise the awareness of coastal archaeology and how important it is as climate change makes storminess worse and eventually will raise the sea level as well. And so we've tried to get a lot of publicity for these kind of sites. So we've had articles in Current Archaeology, in Scottish Archaeology, in The Economist, even in an attempt to spread the word a little bit. And that led us to us receiving the Current Archaeology prize in 2024. But really, that's only about trying to make people understand why this is important and what we might be losing. As you can see, those concentric circles at a high tide are underwater by a considerable amount. Working in those kind of conditions is also interesting when it comes to recording. We tried planning frames and grids, which you can't get into a boulder beach, and tapes, which didn't really work on those slopes. And so we've had to go for more high-tech solutions. And you can see here we have cameras on poles, which give us quite good plans. And of course, because these sites are disappearing, the more information we can get, the more forms of recording we can get, the better. We also use drones from high up for aerial shots, but also close in, hopefully when there aren't people under them, in order to get close-ups and detail, and even to record whole standing walls and sections. And all of those, all that data is georeferenced so that it can be used in the same way we use a normal kind of plan. But it gives us more detail than actually just recording, say with GPS and a pole, which might give us the wall lines. But there is so much complexity in this site that that by itself wouldn't have been enough. We also use scanning. This is from Bradford's Visualising Heritage. This is Bonnie, who was a PhD student with us, recording walls and so on, so that even when the sea has taken this site, we will at least have as much of it recorded as we possibly can. So what was it that interested us about this site? What eventually did we start to see? Well, apart from those concentric walls, we found a whole series of buildings along the beach. We know there is more material behind us, in the actual in the turf there, but of course our whole aim is to record what is disappearing and protect what is left. And to that end, we're also leaving as many of these walls as we can to protect what's behind them. And we know there's a lot behind them because the geophysics shows us that here's that central roundhouse. But you can see that there are other buildings all around it on the landward side, and presumably at least that much has already disappeared into the sea. This is a plan from some years ago. We also do traditional ink plans from those aerial photographs and scans, which gives us another way of visualizing the site. But you can see again, there's the central roundhouse, and here's this strip of other buildings along the shore, which I'm going to show you some of now. This is the first one that we saw, that stone that was sticking out of the boulder beach, which turned out to be part of an Iron Age roundhouse. We have radiocarbon dates from this, which are 1st century BC, 1st century AD, so good Middle Iron Age roundhouse. In this case, built with lots of upright stones, orthostats to mark out where the walls are. And you can see what remains of the floor in there, a nice clay floor with earth over the top of it, and then even the remains of the hearth there in orange. But you can also see there's an abrupt end to that building, and that's because sitting on the slope of the shore like that, this is the part that's already been washed away by the sea. But under that building, which incidentally also has a little oven in it in the side there, or remains of an oven, and part of one of the cells, which you can see is paved beautifully by almost entirely by a single huge slab of stone. But under that building, you can see there are other remains. So this is 1st century BC, 1st century AD, but we have something under that, and you can see here other walls and midden and floors. We could only investigate that to a certain extent because guess what? We hit the water table just below that wall. So we know that there is more material down there. We did core, but we can't get to it. So we know that this site goes back beyond the 1st century BC. Another building just along the coast from that is this, again, a building which has much older origins. There's a very large wall here that it's partly built out of. But right from this top layer of occupation here, we have a Roman coin from the 4th century AD. And below that floor level, another part of the building with an enormous stone tank within it. But we only have that fragment from the shore. We haven't gone back into the site beyond that. This is the story of Swandro, is rebuilding, reforming from earlier buildings for quite a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of them is this little structure here, structure 3, and you can see it's semi-subterranean. There's a passageway and steps actually coming down into it. And the reason for that became clear when we started to look at it. But this itself is built on top of, you can see this big straight wall here, which is something completely different, that I'll tell you about in a little while. The dates from this are also 1st century BC, 1st century AD, it seems. When we came to look at this building, you can see as you come into the doorway, there's a pivot stone for the door on this side and a structure for a bolt on this side. There's also a bolt on the other side, so you can lock it from inside and outside. As you come in, there's a big hearth in front of you, and there would have been this back stone here to stop any drafts coming in from the doorway. This was broken when we excavated it. And on this side, just where this stone is here, we found remains of a clay tuyere. That's the thing on the end of a bellows that keeps the bellows from burning as you poke it into the fire to heat, to get the fire to a higher temperature. So somebody was sitting here on this side of this hearth using bellows, and you can see how black the floor is in here, the amount of carbon that is in those deposits. So we're looking at a smithy. We had evidence for copper alloy working, copper alloy with a lot of zinc in it, which fits with the date, reused Roman material, presumably, and then also evidence for iron working. And the most striking thing about this were these tiny fragments of hammer scale. This is spheroidal hammer scale that you only get if you're doing quite a sophisticated type of iron working, which is called fire forging, I think, if I get it right. And it's really quite high temperatures, so that as the slag comes off, it forms these little droplets like little lead pellets, basically, but iron, obviously. And so we're looking at somewhere where people were working iron and copper alloy in a quite specialized environment. We were lucky that we had Dr. Jerry McDonnell, who's an archaeometallurgist, who could come and look at this, take lots of samples and lots of measurements over this floor to try and understand the working patterns and what was going on in there. And one of the most fascinating things was these two stones next to him, because he noticed they had strike marks on from copper and from iron, which suggests these were anvils. And so not only do we have somebody sitting this side of the hearth with the bellows, but it suggests that the smith was actually working just to Jerry's left there, kneeling on the floor, using these two anvils with a nice cupboard for his tools and the material all around him. And you don't often get to have that kind of feel of how things are being done. The biggest surprise is when we took the bigger anvil up and cleaned it, because what we found underneath, soaked into that stone, were these black smudges here and here and here and here, which really the only thing we can think they can be are marks from the smith's hands as he's using the anvil and getting up and down from it. And these may even be where his knees are pressing against the stone with the grease and the soot and the heat of that semi-subterranean smithy. I said about that strange wall along the back of the smithy that it was actually built on top of and built into. And when we investigated further on the beach side, this is what we found. This is a ditch. It's a stone-lined ditch that seems to go around the entire site. And we're still waiting for some dates from this ditch. We are not sure, but obviously it was out of use, filled in, built over by the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, and it looks like it's been recut and relined several times. Again, we're hindered by the fact we can't go down very much further than that because of the water table. But it does suggest that that we're looking at a settlement with a big central roundhouse, houses all round it, and at least one ditch around the outside of that. And that ditch was filled in by the 1st century AD. If we go back to the roundhouse then and look at what's in there and what might be important, as we excavated further, we got a better idea of the interior of this building, and you can see a large roundhouse type building. It's not a broch, it hasn't got the right kind of walls for a broch. They're solid walls, and they're built from several different eras, as we'll see. So this is somebody who was repurposing an earlier Iron Age roundhouse into something that looked like a broch by the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. You can see there's a passageway in two different phases here, and a little guard house to the side of it, and then passages that go off in two directions there. At this point, it's still filled with rubble, but you can already see that there are divisions within it, kind of different rooms within it. This is one of Bonnie's scans showing the passage into that roundhouse, and the quality of the masonry either side of it, and also the kind of slope of the modern beach. This is the interior once we'd started to excavate it properly. So you can see the passage coming in from the right there. This big wedge-shaped room at the top, and two rooms off to the left, and then another one partly removed where the rest of the side has been eroded at the bottom of the slide there, with lots and lots of hearths. And this is one of the features of this structure. It's very long-lived, and it is altered quite a lot, but certainly for the major part of its life, what's on those bottom floors is not particularly domestic. It looks more like craft work and technological work rather than where someone is living. The exception to that partly is that top room, this wedge-shaped room, which has right at the end of its life, it does look more domestic. It has things like pins and needles and spindle whorls and so on within it, and looks as if it's being used. But at the stage you can see here, there's at least two hearths. There is what looks like an oven built into a cell on the far right side there, and another cell on the top left side, right next to a bottom quernstone. If we look inside that room, as I said, there's many phases to it, lots of different floors, and the things move around a little bit, but you can still see towards the bottom of the slide there that huge hearth, and the second one next to it, and the quernstone over to the right. Right in the top of the photograph there in the centre, you can see the doorway, which is still partially blocked at this point, but this is the doorway into this building. And what I think is quite striking is the way that the room is kind of marked off by these big orthostats, these big standing stones, which look pretty battered now because of the erosion. But you have to imagine that you can see that these would have all at one point been at one level and would have produced a rather nice looking stone interior, which is possibly coloured yellow. You might just be able to see on this bottom stone here and on this wall behind, there's a lot of yellow clay used to colour the walls really and make them look lighter. This is an aerial view into that room. Here's the doorway at the bottom, in the middle of the bottom of the slide, and you can see you step through that doorway. There's actually another pivot stone there to keep the door closed, and then you step onto a nice bit of stone paving before you go on to the earth floor and the hearth and so on beyond. Kind of finds we were getting from that building include glass toggle beads like the one that's being held there and that you can see at the top of the slide, a couple of antler weaving combs, spindle whorls and so on. So a fair number of finds actually from the floors of that room. There again, you can see that same wedge-shaped room at the bottom there, but you can also see to the side, to the right, these two other rooms, which are also quite specialist. And then the area with the hearths at the top. And these also produce things that we really didn't expect, and we haven't seen anything quite like. But it does seem to look as if the whole of this bottom floor And we think there was probably, looking at those alcoves and the way they work, although there weren't stairs like there would have been in a broch, it looks like there was an upper floor and access to it from those little alcoves. And so it looks like the bottom floor was where craft activities, technological activities took place, and they were actually living in an upper floor above. Some of the kinds of things we found, this is a top left there is an antler cheek piece from a horse harness. Over to its right, that's a belt hook, an Iron Age belt hook that was found in the wedge-shaped room. And bottom left there is an example of some of the stuff that was coming from one of the other rooms where there seemed to be a lot of antler and bone working happening. But most of the things we found were only partly made or they were broken, like this rather lovely weaving comb with a fishtail to it. And you can see it's quite rough still. It's not been polished up, although the teeth have been polished, but one of the teeth is broken, and that's probably why it was discarded. In the one of the other rooms, we had this strange, huge hearth with these two whalebone vertebrae embedded in the floor either side, with holes drilled into them. And you can see Alice there is holding one of those vertebrae when we took it from the ground. It had been partly shaped in order to put it in the ground. We can only assume that was for some kind of superstructure over that hearth, whether that was for cooking, for holding metal pots over the hearth for cooking, or for some other purpose, we don't really know. Just to the left of that hearth, you can see a couple of steps which go up into the next room. And that was a real surprise because in that room, we found a furnace. This is an iron smelting furnace. There's very few of them in Orkney. A few being found in other parts of Scotland. Again, probably Middle Iron Age. This may well be where the iron that was being smelted, being worked in the smithy, was being produced, being smelted. We're still waiting for some dates from that as well and some other information, but it does seem to be for iron production. Right at when we got to the bottom floors in all these rooms last year, we found that they had been many of them had been paved, really well constructed. You can see the passageway coming through there as well, with that lovely paving. And under that, there was a strange construction layer, which was clay and small stone chippings and so on that had all been packed really tightly. And that inner wall of this roundhouse was built on that construction layer. So the inner wall is no older than that. And jammed right against the wall in that construction layer was this lovely pot. We having trouble finding parallels for it, but it appears to be probably early Iron Age. So it looks like that is the construction layer, the foundation deposit, if you like, for this inner building. But of course, that leaves us then with the problem of if that's the inner building, what are all those other walls and how old is this structure to start with? So we had to go back and start looking again and trying to understand what was happening. But actually, one of the things we suspected right from the beginning was that there might be an older structure under this because some of those inner walls are not on the same alignment. They're not concentric with the outer walls. And so we began to think that the whole thing had been built on something else. And if you look, this is that inner part of the photograph was taken once we'd taken away that construction layer flooring. And you can see in that top room and all round just the tops of those concentric walls, which are on a completely different alignment to the outer ones. So there's something under all of this which is older. And when we came to look in amongst those walls, we couldn't find any domestic debris. We had no charred plant remains, no animal bone, no artifacts to speak of. So it looks as if whatever is under this domestic early Iron Age building is not early Iron Age and is not domestic. And that's really as much as we can say at the moment. We don't have any dates from it yet, and we don't have any evidence apart from the fact that we now are understanding a little bit more about how this roundhouse was constructed, because that big wall going down towards the sea is younger than some of these inner walls. It's actually sitting on Midden that we have a date from, which is somewhere between 800 and 500 BC. So this wall was built at some point after that, which makes most of these walls either contemporary with that date or earlier still. And some of them are definitely earlier than this wall here. Right at the end of the excavation, last year, we noticed voids appearing under some of the stonework in that entrance passageway, and we thought we should probably have a look. It's one of those mistakes you make at the end of an excavation. It opens up all kinds of other possibilities. Here's the sillstone into the roundhouse, and you can see under it is another void. This is a smaller passageway, or maybe a large drain that runs right into the centre of the roundhouse and out through the passageway. It's beautifully constructed, very meaningfully constructed, and we have absolutely no idea what it is, and we cannot get at more of it without removing the roundhouse, which we can't do for many reasons, not least because the walls of that roundhouse are protecting the rest of the site, and also the water table is down there. But one of the useful things that this taught us was that this side of the passage wall, which had always looked earlier and made from very large stones, and you can just about see it there, is definitely older than the rest of the roundhouse. So the roundhouse is a composite made of earlier parts of other structures. It's going to take us a long time to unpick that and try and work out what's happening there. The end of Swandro seems to have come quite suddenly. Right on top of all those activity layers, that there is no abandonment layer, there's no old ground surface or anything like that. The walls have collapsed on top of it all, and those walls are in places look like not like accidental collapse, but like deliberate deposition. You can see the way that the line of collapse is through the middle of a round building, which is very strange and doesn't really happen that way. So there is a certain amount of deliberate destruction and also removal of some stone, presumably for use elsewhere. And a clue to what might be happening there is that right in the top of that passageway into the roundhouse, amidst all this rubble and so on, there was a little patch which had two butchered cat skeletons, articulated cat skeletons within it, and a coin, a 9th century Northumbrian coin. And when you consider that right next to the site, literally a few minutes walk away, is the cemetery of Westness, which includes both Pictish burials, Christian Pictish burials, and on top of those 9th, 10th century Viking burials. I think we've got a fairly good clue as to what happened at the end of Swandro and who might have caused some of that destruction. We've got a lot of work to do on the post-excavation yet still to try and work that out. So the last thing we have to do in terms of excavation, we're hoping to do next year, and that's to look at the right at the beginning. I think I mentioned to you that there's a longhouse called Westness, which is right next to Swandro. It's classed as a separate site, but actually you can see that it is here. And the edge of that Westness roundhouse at the top right there actually sits over the smithy and the ditch. So it's actually part of the same site. It's just the last phase of this settlement, a settlement that seems to stretch way back into prehistory. And it was excavated in the 1970s, and that's never been published, and we don't have much information about it. We don't have any dates either. So the very last thing we need to do to complete the story of Swandro really is to look at the only bit of that site that hasn't been excavated, which is the last few meters next to the beach, and hopefully we can get some dates and some information as to how that sits with the rest of this site. So if you're around next year, hopefully you will see us on Rousay excavating the last part of that Westness roundhouse, the Swandro longhouse. And I'm hoping that what that has shown you is that these little unregarded sites, there was hardly anything to be seen here before we started, have a massive amount of information in them. The slightly alarming side of all of this is under that smithy and under that ditch, as we got to the bottom of the site, under that beautiful archaeological material that had all those finds in it still in situ, even the little bits of slag and so on, we found sand. And that sand had pieces of plastic in it. And so we can't assume that coastal erosion only comes inland vertically. It doesn't. The tide is coming in through these deposits, through the bottom of these deposits, every day, wave by wave, and it's taking away the fine deposits and the organic material, and it's replacing it with sand and plastics. So even a site that looks good on the surface like this one is disappearing, not just from the coastline but from underneath as well. And that's quite a sobering thought, but it also spurs us on to do what we can to save Swandro and other sites from the sea before we lose them entirely. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much.